Good morning, everyone. Very pleased to be here. So I'll take you on a journey, and also we'll try and make sure that my thought process is well illustrated, and then we can dive into Q&A because it's a thorny topic. So let's start with this. 10 years from now. Of course, if things go as they do, then we are behind. In fact, we're already behind. But if we keep on being behind as Europeans, then of course, very few companies have captured the flow of technology, and I call it knowledge as a service, which is the worst possible scenario for humanity as a whole, but possibly also for us as Europeans. Now, if they do capture all of this flow of information and also value in terms of business, then of course, perhaps two states in the world, such as the state of California and the state of Washington, will be able to provide universal revenue to their citizens. Meanwhile, we go bankrupt. Not a desirable future. So let me give you a glimpse of my track record and my personal story, because it's a story that I feel has given me a proper understanding of where we are and where I want France and Europe to be for my children. So this is when I started, computers, 8-bit computers, companies I've worked for, startups I've founded, so actually sold a number of them, unfortunately. So I failed. I failed every time because I did not create a European big tech. Neither did we. So that's an issue. I was CEO at Scaleway, now Probable, so I'll tell you more about that in a bit. I'm also investing in a number of companies because I believe that we need to keep exploring. So whenever I can, I support entrepreneurs to explore different avenues. But for the past 25 years, I have been competing directly against these companies, systematically. So I must be a masochist, clearly. Now, two logos on the right side, you can see, TensorFlow, PyTorch. I'm now competing against Meta and Google, in a way, because it's not direct. But the point is, either corporations or massive open source projects, basically, I believe that we need to tackle the giants in a way that is systematic, in a way that is significant for us. So, quick history navigation. I promise this will be quick. So, 7 decades in 70 seconds. Let's go. Computers started with humans inside. Too complicated, sold as a service, in fact, with humans inside. Then things got easier with the cardboards, still not very intuitive. These are two people that you might recognize, creators of the C programming language and the Unix operating system. So things, every decade, there's a new paradigm shift in the way we use computers. After that, you have the terminal, right, with a centralized computing unit, but the terminal. Some of you in the room are old enough to remember this next decade, painful, if you survived it. Good job. Then graphical user interface, invented at the Palo Alto Xerox Center, which was the inspiration for Steve Jobs to bring the Macintosh, which was the inspiration for Microsoft 3.1, a pale copy. 10 years after, mobile devices, some of them connected, some not. 10 years later, the convergence, all in one. So every decade, there's a new paradigm shift in the way we use computers. Now, let's map this over the past and then map it forward. I'll talk about accessibility, right? It's not about cost, it's about how you access computers as a function of your ability to harness the technology. Now, in the past, you needed a degree, so therefore very few people had access. But the more we go forward, especially with a smartphone, so haptic user interfaces, tactile. Almost everyone was able to use it, but pull this forward, it's all about augmented reality and ultimately augmented humanity. We can feel a glimpse of that with a smartphone. Now, what's interesting is that in the past, interfaces were artificial. They are becoming natural with a lot of AI. Because AI, especially the new kind of AI, is perfect to interface machines with humans, because this AI adapts to us. It's the reverse of the past, where we had to adapt to it. So this trend is basically unfolding as we speak, through the help of exponential technologies. Now, you all know this curve, which is sort of stopped right now. So that's Moore's law. But the point is, Moore's law plus big data plus AI keeps on being exponential. In fact, possibly a double or triple exponential. Let's call it high tech, right? So if you combine all the laws together, it's frighteningly fast. It is impossible, even for the best researchers in AI, to actually be on top of everything. It's impossible. It's humanly impossible. So if you compare to human biology, we are the flat line. And I've been in tech forever, probably same for you. I'm eating algorithms and data and AI for breakfast. Same for some of you. Basically, I don't know if you feel the same, but I feel a tear in the fabric. It is becoming complicated as a society to digest what it means. So how can we possibly harness this? You perhaps know this quote from Mark Anderson, founder of Netscape, which later became a dark side VC. He actually perfectly captured the potentiality of software. In fact, I would say that VCs love software as a service because it is the ultimate form of value capture. And I think our problem nowadays is mostly a problem of as a service. Remember back in the days where we could download software or buy a floppy, we owned the license. Nowadays, we no longer own anything, right? So software is hitting the world, 2011, VCs have been reaping the benefits of software as a service. Now, there's another clever guy, came after that, said, AI is going to eat software. 2016. What a ride. Now, of course, the inference is AI is going to eat the world. Is this acceptable? I don't think so. So, sorry, wrong date, but this should be our posture. We need to fight back. AI should not be a black box, right? It should be basically a set of techniques that all of us master. We should own it in a way that we understand it, we can replicate it, and this is actually linked to all the values that we care for in open source. The problem here, again, talk about exponentials. So this is LECHELLE, who was beaten by a machine, trained on AI, of course, but he was also trained with humans in the loop, right? So nobody actually predicted, even the best experts in AI, that this would be feasible back when it happened. They thought, maybe in 10 years, Go is too hard. Right? So even the experts got it wrong by a factor of 10 years. And this is a study that shows that if you ask experts about certain skills that AI will succeed at, if you ask them in 2017, I think, on the left side, so the blue dots, for every skill, they said this is going to be, sorry, so the 2017 was in gray on the right side. So they thought this is going to happen in 20 or 30 or 50 years. You ask them the question again 5 years after, and they say, oh, it's happening next year. So everyone gets it wrong on specific skills. So the point is, we are on a trajectory where we think traditionally in terms of software, within which there is AI, within which there is deep learning, machine learning, GPT. Interesting, the term GPT, by the way. Generally pre-trained transformers, but in fact also means general purpose technology. So this acronym leads to this, which is, again, difficult to predict and also possibly undesirable in a number of ways. So let's talk about big tech for a second. These companies are more powerful than states in some cases. It's no longer desirable, and you can tell that they are quite ambivalent in so many ways. Remember this guy? Linux is cancer, 2005. And then, of course, he understood the power of software also, right? Developers. I'm not going to dance like him, promise. Now, what's interesting is that the patient should be dead if Linux is cancer, because 95% of Azure is running on Linux today. It didn't start that way. Now, if you look at these companies cumulatively, so I'm not going to talk about the Magnificent Seven in terms of stock market, but more like 5 companies on this map here. They are worth $12 trillion, give or take, depending on Trump's announcements. They have access to 5 billion human beings. And of course, if you add the latest kid in town, NVIDIA, they add another cool $3 trillion valuation. So that's $15 trillion of valuation. And we complain about Europe being behind in terms of GDP, right? We are behind the US in terms of GDP. But in fact, if you remove tech, these guys, from the equation in the US is actually on par with Europe over the past 15 years, right? So the 15 years past us that have created an 80% increase of GDP in the US is 100% attributed to these guys. They capture all of the value, and we happily pay. Right? I have a Mac, okay, I apologize. But you have PCs as well, right? Some of you have Dells. Components are coming from chips. You're using NVIDIA, or you're using Intel or AMD. These are technologies that are largely imported. And we pay, and we pay, and we pay. So now let's think software. What do we put on top of hardware? This is the dangerous stack that people fail to understand at the political level. It is a very complex stack, and you cannot just think data centers. You cannot just think, oh, Microsoft Suite. It's the whole thing. So let's take a look at this family of technologies in the Microsoft world, for instance. Office 365 sits on top of Azure. They happily bundle it. They know how to. And then, of course, NVIDIA at the bottom with Intel AMD. OpenAI is in the Microsoft family. So all of that creates a sort of bundle where it's really, really hard to compete. In fact, if you think Google has the same stack with Workspace. In fact, big tech competes against big tech. Let's do a quick mapping here. So primarily looking at the cloud technologies, 70% is captured by US companies. China is actually quite big at 4%. Europe is nowhere. And if you check the boxes in terms of stacks and layers, then you've got interesting players. Now, this is the perfect layer for AI deployment, if they have it all. But the most dangerous companies here are Microsoft and Google, because they do B2B and B2C. They have access to every human on the planet, almost. You could add Apple here in a way, but they don't do B2B. So these companies are essentially a bottleneck for innovation in AI, typically, to be widely distributed without going through, of course, their toll and the pricing schedule. Now, of course, AI could collapse anytime. Maybe we're in a bubble. This was an article back in 2024 or end of 2023, right? So at the time we thought, it's hype. Well, turns out that if you look at the Magnificent Seven, they actually are keeping to ramp up. Apple was first for a while, but basically you've got three companies at $3 trillion valuation each. It is mind-numbing. A $3 trillion company can, if they want to, change our mind 1% at a time. They have the means to change our mind 1% at a time in this room, or possibly the entire population in Brussels. They can. Now, there is hope. In fact, we've been sold public cloud for the past 20 years or so, right? There is a swing back, right? There's an article by this CTO of probably a pioneering SaaS company, so it's a small company, and they left the cloud, saving $6 million a year, because he said, the public cloud is a false promise. It's very good for startups that have no budget, because you can adopt a very scalable public cloud on AWS, GCP, OVH, Scaleway, right? You can adopt it very quickly, so you pay very little. And if you explode, you have a good solution because you can explode with those platforms. And the other case where public cloud is useful is on the far end of established companies that have very high volatility. Anyone in the middle should not be using the cloud or should not be using the public cloud. That's what he said. That's what he proved. So a company that has a stable business actually should hire sysops. because that's actually cost efficient. So why don't we start owning our technology again? Because the current discourse of knowledge as a service, SaaS, software as a service, is perhaps flawed. And that is the case. I mean, some companies are actually going back and internalizing their cloud with the private cloud. Let's take a look at geopolitics. What's wrong with this picture? It's an article from The Economist. Anyone? Yeah, Europe. Europe is nowhere. This was said by Kai-Fu Lee, 2018. We're in 2025, 7 years, Europe is still nowhere. We are nowhere in terms of capturing value. This is a slide that I did earlier last year. Now, NVIDIA sold 500,000 H100 chips in 2023. At the time, there was an announcement by Scaleway. So I was CEO at Scaleway from 2020 to 2023, but I was no longer at Scaleway at the time. But Scaleway announced the biggest AI cluster in Europe with 1,000 chips. The biggest European cluster in Europe with 1,000 chips. That's 0.2% of the order book for NVIDIA. Europe, GDP-wise, is 20%. So it's 100 times less than what it should be. So let's take a look at the big picture here. America first, disengaging from the partnership with Europe. America first against China, of course. COVID, where Europeans realized they could not even make their own masks. Then wars against Ukraine, of course, now Middle East. Gen AI. If that is not a wake-up call for Europeans, I don't know what is. But it's a wake-up call to everybody, actually, because the world is no longer what it was. So what if scenarios? What if our dependencies are so critical and that there's a conflict between China and Taiwan? If there's an issue with South Korea providing chips, again, we love open source, but chips are made somewhere. And what about the US? What if we get upset with the US? Actually, there was a little sparring between Trump and Macron just last night. What if Trump decides to shut down France or Europe? They can, actually. They did that with the International Court of Justice. They removed someone's email account by federal order. So the US has the kill switch. Again, I think they're a democracy, so far so good, and they should be our ally. They are, on paper. But what if? Europe should be a sparring partner to the US, not a junior partner. Let's talk about Europe for a second. So our singularity, I think, I'm biased. I like democracy. I like what France and Europe has to offer. Diversity, languages, culture. Sure, built on a history of wars. But actually, Europe strikes a balance. Allow me this graph. If the world is a composite of these forces where you have citizens and corporations and states, well, I think the center of gravity is pretty low because corporations and states are powerful. But Europe is actually well-centered. It is a good balance, but again, I'm biased. Feel free to tell me that you disagree. But China is also, fairly centered, actually. Chinese people feel pretty good on a day-to-day basis. Actually, they were lifted off poverty over 100 years. So the Chinese, they accept the government so far. So they get value out of it. But it's still state-centered. US is very much corporation-centered, right? Profits, driven by corporations, and then everyone tags along. Europe is different, built different. And I think that's fine. We should defend that. So how do we do that? Well, first, we identify what we care about. We list those things that we care for, and we start fighting for them. So this is my journey, of course. My journey is one of a technophile, technologue. I've been coding, well, I still do actually, but I'm too slow and too expensive. But I started coding, I was 10 years old, right? I believe technology is actually a force for good. So what if we started building on these things by being fully aware that we are too dependent, and we've actually let it go. So actually in this room, I know that a lot of you are thinking right, because here we understand what open source does. But I'll tell you why it's actually not so much as a philosophy as it is a strategy and a tactic. Now, again, back to this notion of transparency. This quote we all love, but it's fake, it's dangerous, it's toxic, it's a trap. Technology should not be seen as magic. It should be seen as something we control. It has become too important, right? Magic, by the way, as a term, means deception. It means to deceive human beings. So we should avoid any trap. We should be engineers, be able to lift the hood, see what's under the engine. We need to go back to understanding. And again, in this room, a lot of you do, but that's the message that we need to bring to society. Bring everyone on board. Re-engineer our ability to understand and, you know, make sure that it's not magic. And each of us, of course, is an enabler and a decision maker. So we need to think about everything at once. Technology stacks, dependencies, hidden costs, geoeconomics, and geopolitics. Because that's what's at stake. Now, opportunities, there are plenty. I'm highlighting a few keywords here, and I'll tell you about my new project, Probable. I chose this project because the project chose me. I'll tell you about the story briefly, but essentially, a team from INRIA came to see me, and I identified something which is worth fighting for. So I highlighted a few keywords here, put them in a bag, and this led to Probable, my new mission. Why? Because it is heavily open source by design, by default, and I think that perhaps that is our only hope, to make sure that we can transfer technology to as many people as possible. So quickly, before I dive into Probable, let's not forget that there are forces at play. So La French Tech, for instance, unicorns, right? Politicians love unicorns. In fact, this started in the US in the 70s, in Silicon Valley. Actually, 100 years ago in terms of fundraising and VC funding, with Bessemer as a 100-year-old VC. But Silicon Valley was coined in 1971, my year of birth, by the way. So Silicon Valley, 1970s, that's 5-6 generations of VC funding. A fund lasts 10 years, so that's 5-6 generations. UK started a decade before us, France, Germany, the decade after. So we only have 2 generations of VC funding. We're behind, using the playbook from Silicon Valley. And plus, we're doing it at a smaller scale. So where are we in terms of sovereignty? Nowhere. Kai-Fu Lee said it. For AI, it's actually true for cloud as well. Actually, I'm being facetious. It's 1%. So 1% is actually more a measure I do for France. And the way I measure it is the amount of technology purchased from France for the needs of French corporations. So 1%. Now, the French GDP is 3%. So any nation that is part of nations that provides any sort of industry should float at its level. Which means that if we're at 1% and 3% is the floating line, every year we sink. It's terrible. So if we look at the political possibilities, then of course there can be some changes, but we need to first measure. Good news, at 1% we can almost easily go up. Now, how do we do that? Well, open source, it is the response from the challenger. And the numbers are there. They're intriguing because 1 billion of investment at the European level leads to 65 to 95 billion euros of return. Now, we don't know where they go. Maybe they go to China. But let's assume that let's simplify. 1 turns into 100. If Europe is 20% GDP, we get 20. So it's a net plus. Do you know of any investment that goes from 1 to 20? Certainly not subsidies in the way we do it, because we sprinkle. Now, what if we only invested or stimulated open source? Interesting. You know this. The highest form of sovereignty is knowledge. And we, in France, Europe at large, we produce tremendous engineering skills. And there's a history of open source and free software that dates back to the 70s. And I would argue that Richard Stallman had a reaction to IBM owning the whole thing, sucking the air out of the oxygen out of the air. Situation is still the same, right? So there's been an evolution. We have instruments. But in conclusion, we need to own our AI. How do we do that? Of course, open source. Now, probable. It started off with scikit-learn. Anyone familiar with scikit-learn here in the room? 10%. So I assume you're not data scientists. No worries, I'm not either. I have no merit for scikit-learn. I'm just the entrepreneur in the room for scikit-learn. Now, scikit-learn has been developed in France at the INRIA Research Center. And over the past 15 years, it has harnessed 2.5 billion downloads. More than PyTorch and TensorFlow combined. Nobody knows it's French. Nobody knows it's European. And people take it for granted. It's free. Why would they care for a second? Now, what's more interesting is that if you look at the number of GitHub dependencies, scikit-learn has generated 1.3 million dependencies on GitHub. The entire world of data science depends on this. So of course, there is deep learning, PyTorch and TensorFlow. Actually, PyTorch is essentially rendering TensorFlow quite obsolete. So there are two main libraries in the world when it comes to AI, data science, and machine learning, scikit-learn and PyTorch. TensorFlow has become, recently, and over the past 3 years, quite less dynamic than PyTorch. Now, scikit-learn is used by every company in the world, every machine learning product in the world. Again, 1.3 million GitHub dependencies. That's for the publicly visible dependencies. And INRIA and France 2030 and of course the scikit-learn community came to see me because they were looking to monetize this asset. Now, you know there are two ways with open source to monetize it. You can switch the license and upset the community. And of course, some people will have to pay. Or you can decide that the asset remains open source in the original license. This is what we decided. This project is too important for it to be affected by a license switch. And that was not the deal I had with the founders anyway, so it makes perfect sense. Scikit-learn belongs to humanity already. So we are protecting it. And we have a mission as a company, which is to develop and maintain, at the state of the art, a complete suite of machine learning solutions, not limited to scikit-learn, not limited to machine learning, but also AI. So this is the company that we're building. Of course, people behind this company, we are 14 co-founders. We're probably one of the biggest team founding a startup. But we are an open source startup with commercial value proposition. So this is who we are, based on a very pure asset that everyone uses for breakfast if you're a data scientist. You take your coffee and you use scikit-learn. Every data scientist on the planet. Actually, scikit-learn, being French, is 22% downloads in the US, 25% China, 5% UK, 4% Germany, 3% France. So it's 97% export. But we're building a company based on the DNA of the asset to build additional services and solutions on top of it. One of them is Score, which is solving a 50 billion euro bottleneck in data science. Because it turns out that data science is complicated. And companies waste a lot of money with the management not being able to harness the effects and the benefits of machine learning, including scikit-learn. So essentially, we're building the antidote to this wonderful asset. So it's called Score, and we're building a platform that companies can use to harness this. So I'll spare you the details, but basically there is an open source component, which is additive to scikit-learn, so MIT license, permissive, and then of course a platform that will be deployed on top of it to allow companies to collaborate. We design it on premises and we deliver it as bring your own cloud, multi-cloud, or also possibly in SaaS. So the client has choice, always. Our tagline is this one: own your data science, but this is my tagline limited to my scope today. The message to you is this one: if knowledge as a service is an existential threat, at the geo-economical level, but also at the societal level, then the answer is own your AI. You cannot let that happen. It is existential. I believe so. So I wrote an article here in French, sorry, at the time, Openness as Policy, I'll be translating it. L'arme du challenger et du chevalier de la connaissance. The highest form of sovereignty is knowledge. Therefore, if you extend knowledge to code, to data, to science, to weights, open hardware, then finally you are not going to be trapped into the knowledge as a service value proposition. Thank you.